What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, bringing you your favorite weekly series, the Pokemon Card Auctions of the Week recap. Folks, this week I think I got an amazing recap assembled for you. We'll be taking a look at some newly graded cards from Journey Together. We will also be reviewing a plethora of Black Label cards that came through. Seems like everybody was trying to offload their Black Label cards this week for some reason. And we'll be taking a look at numerous booster box sales, especially from the Sun and Moon era. So stay tuned for all of that and more. Thank you so much for watching. A quick shout out to today's auction recap sponsor. It is KantoShark.com, the ultimate Pokemon card marketplace. The recent sales on KantoShark.com have been extraordinary, to say the least, as they specialize in selling high-end vintage sealed product as well as some very high-end graded slabs. And their inventory just keeps on growing with new grails added to the marketplace every week. In today's Pokemon TCG market, you need to make sure you are buying from a trustworthy and legitimate seller. That's where KantoShark.com comes in. A link to their website will be in the description of this video. Go check them out and let me know what you pick up. All right, folks, we have a lot to go over this week. Let's get started off with this guy right here, the Drowzee illustration rare from Scarlet and Violet base. Has come down quite a bit from what it was selling for. Here we saw a sale of $410, and then we also saw a sale for under $400 this week. And if you don't know, this card was selling for between $700 and $800. It was so hyped up, but it has since been about cut in half. But we will keep an eye on this card for weeks to come. And then here, folks, is a non-holo Umbreon from the recent McDonald's collection that sold as a PSA 10 for $142. And I did not know this card was this valuable as a PSA 10. I actually got a few of these Umbreons from kids getting Happy Meals. So yeah, I might have to send those in for grading. And then here are those graded cards from Journey Together. Up first, we have a PSA 10 Ends Reshiram promo card that sold for $296 this week. Here is the Lily's Clefairy EX. This is not the special illustration rare, but this one here sold as a PSA 10 for $245, while the special illustration rare version sold for $1,822. Wowza. And then lastly, we saw this Salamence EX special illustration rare that sold for $1,077 as a PSA 10. Up next, we have a couple more modern graded cards that I found interesting. Here's a Palafin EX from Prismatic Evolutions. We saw two sales of this card this week, one for $401, another one for $440. Up next, we saw both the Latios and the Latias from Surging Sparks, both graded a PSA 10 and sold for $903 this week. And then here, folks, this card just keeps going up and up. It is the Stained Glass Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno GX promo from the Hidden Fates Elite Trainer box. This card sold this week for $182 as a PSA 10. And if you don't know, this card has an insane amount of 10s. I think it has 20,183 PSA 10 copies as of right now, and it just keeps climbing higher and higher. But it is definitely an S-tier illustration if I've ever seen one. Here we have a secret rare Gardevoir from Steam Siege, and if you've watched my recent videos, you know that these cards from Steam Siege are just through the roof for some reason. As PSA 10s this week, this card sold for $670. Up next, we saw a Mega Charizard EX from Generations, sold as a PSA 10 for $950, along with this Full Art Lucario EX from Furious Fists, sold as a PSA 10 for $3,400 this week. Next, we have this lot of all four of the Staff Holos from Evolutions, the Gyarados, Machamp, Mewtwo, and Charizard, all graded a PSA 9 and sold collectively for $2,550. These are very, very difficult cards to get as 10s. The quality control on these bad boys were just awful. So yeah, here is a lot of 25 sealed Gold Star Greninja promo cards that sold for a total of $345. And it's worth noting that the PSA 10 copy of the Gold Star Greninja still sells for a hefty amount at about $232. Speaking of celebrations, we saw a master set of celebrations, including the gold promo cards, sold for a total of $381. And then on to numerous Black Label cards. Now, as we're going through these cards, folks, I want you to pay attention to them and let me know what sticks out. Ready? All right. Here is a Celebi Amazing Rare from Vivid Voltage. Got the Black Label and sold for $411. Here we have the Regidrago V from Silver Tempest that sold for $1,248. And then also from Silver Tempest was this Duraludon VMAX that sold for an even $500. Here we have the Mewtwo GX, the Japanese Mewtwo GX. They got the black label and sold for $13,000 this week. If you haven't noticed by now, the black labels, the actual black labels on these cards are like falling all over the place. Like falling down into the card, they're like wrapping around the back. What is going on over there at Beckett, and why can't they seem to secure these black labels? What's up with that? Here is a Japanese black label Ice Rider Calyrex VMAX that sold for $1,725, along with the Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX that also sold for $1,725. Here is a black label Mewtwo V-Star from Crown Zenith that sold for $2,350 with a jacked up label. Here is a Charizard VMAX from Shining Fates that sold for $1,814, while the black label Charizard VMAX from Champion's Path sold for $2,136. Up next, we have this beautiful Japanese Flareon EX that sold for $6,250. Here is an EVEX that sold for $612, along with this SIR EVEX that sold for $1,775. Here is a black label Vaporeon V that sold for $2,651. And then we saw two of the Japanese Umbreon EXs from Terrestrial Festival. This one here sold for $6,600. While this other one here sold for $6,900. Before we get to the sealed product, let's take a look at this master set of Crown Zenith that sold for $1,325. Crown Zenith is indeed one of the best modern sets from Sword and Shield. Alright, some interesting pieces of sealed product. Here is a Blooming Waters Premium Collection Box, the one you get from Costco that sells for about $112.50. Here we have an Ultra Premium Collection Shrink-Wrapped Hidden Fates box that sold for $785. And in this, you get the Gold Lunala and Solgaleo, along with that Rayquaza GX, so pretty awesome there. And I've been seeing several auctions that have tons of booster packs in them. Here is a lot of 356 Scarlet and Violet base set booster packs that sold for $1,591. Here we have a lot of 400 151 booster packs that sold for a total of $5,000. And then here is a lot of 368 Prismatic Evolutions booster packs that sold for $5,100. And then here is a lot of 4 Prismatic Evolutions booster bundle cases that sold for $3,150 this week. We have also seen a tremendous rise in these Charizard UPCs. Here's one that sold for $242, and then we saw a lot of 4 of these boxes sell for $855, along with this 151 Ultra Premium Collection box that sold for $305 this week. Here we have an Evolving Skies booster box that sold for $1,300, while a case of them sold for an even $8,000 this week, along with this Evolutions booster box that sold for $1,290, while a case of 6 sold for $8,600. And then we saw a bunch of Sun and Moon booster boxes come by sealed. Here is a Sun and Moon base set booster box that sold for $540. Here's a Guardians Rising box that sold for $680. We saw 2 Burning Shadows booster boxes. This one sold for $705. The other one sold for $785. Here is a Crimson Invasion box that sold for $405. By far the worst Sun and Moon set, for sure. Here is an Ultra Prism booster box that sold for $955. I remember opening up a case of these Ultra Prism boxes and having fun and ripping packs like an idiot. I should have been hoarding these. Man. Here we have a Forbidden Light booster box that sold for $835, and they might as well call this Forgotten Light because I always forget about this set for some reason. Here is a Lost Thunder booster box that sold for $1,326. And then, of course, the Team Up booster box always does the best, selling for $4,700 this week. Here is an Unbroken Bonds booster box that sold for $1,500, while the Unified Minds has been doing exceptionally well also, selling for $2,251. And then one more piece of sealed product. I saw one of these PokeRev mystery packs in the wild. I always wonder what they sell for. This one here is the 6.0 version and sold for $102.50 in auction. Up next, we saw a bunch of Charizards from the WOTC era. Here is a CGC10 Unlimited base set Charizard Charizard that sold for $3,011. And then folks, we saw a couple of base set Charizards graded by an obscure grading company. It doesn't even say what the company is in the title, but this company graded this Zard a 10 and it sold for $1,925. Here is a raw shadowless base set Charizard that sold for $1,458. And then this company again graded a first edition base set Charizard that sold for an even $15,000. And if you're wondering if this is a strong copy, if this is a strong 10, it is not. This card would by no means grade a 10 in I don't think any other grading card company, so they were pretty lenient on this first edition Zard. Here we have a first edition Blaine's Charizard as a PSA 10, sell for $5,501. A first edition Shining Charizard from Neo Destiny sold for $14,225. And then we saw this raw first edition Lugia from Neo Genesis, sold for $4,150. And according to the title and description, this is a pristine example, so I hope it grades well. Speaking of Lugia, here is a first edition PGC-10 Lugia Holo from Neo Genesis that sold for $2,600, while the first edition Typhlosion 17, which also got a PGC-10, sold for $1,100. Here are a couple of very notable holos from Neo Destiny. Here's a first edition Houndoom, or Dark Houndoom, that sold for $1,046. The first edition Caesar sold for $1,275. This first edition Dark Typhlosion sold for $1,536. This Light Dragonite sold for $3,408. The Dark Tyranitar sold for $3,601. And then finally, the Dark Gengar sold for the most at $5,300. A couple of cards from the E-Series, most notably Skyridge, was this Holo Alakazam as a PSA 10, sold for $2,112. Here is a PSA 10 Moltres, also from Skyridge, sold for $1,307. And then here is a PSA 9 Gengar from Skyridge that sold for $3,200. And if you recall, a week or so ago, this guy sells as a PSA 10 for well over $10,000. Here we have a CGC 10 Pristine Arcanine from Aquapolis that sold for $2,025. And then here is a Tag 10 Umbreon Holo from Skyridge that sold for $7,600 this week. Next is this BGS 10 Latios EX from EX Dragon that sold for $3,550. And then here is a Black Label Japanese Alakazam Level X that sold for $1,667. And then lastly, on eBay, we saw this Team Magma's Groudon EX as a PSA 8 sell for $483. And last week, this card sold for very close to 10 grand. And this seems to be a very desired card, whether it's raw or graded, really. Up next, we saw cards from Fanatics Collect Weekly Auction Block. Here is a Blastoise EX from Fire Red Leaf Green, sold as a PSA 10 for $2,070. Here is a CGC 10 Pristine Houndoom from Skyridge that sold for $2,190. Here is another Light Dragonite. This one is a first edition PSA 10 that sold for $3,120. Here is a first edition Dark Blastoise from Team Rocket that sold for $4,800 this week. Here is a CGC 10 Pristine first edition Holo Blissey from Neo Revelation. Very tough card to get in a 10. Sold for $4,920 this week. Along with this PSA 10 Red Cheeks base set Pikachu that sold for $5,040. Here is a first edition Dragonite from Fossil, sold for $5,760. Here is a PSA 10 Japanese Shining Mewtwo that sold for $9,300, along with this Japanese Gold Star Mew that sold for $10,500. And then lastly, on Fanatics, we saw this PSA 10 Crystal Lugia sell for $16,200. And we're going to finish up this auction recap with some auctions from Alt. Here is a Jirachi EX from Crystal Guardians as a PSA 10 that sold for $1,163, along with this Reverse Holo Jirachi from Deoxys that sold as a PSA 10 for $1,853. Here is a Black Label Japanese Lugia V that sold for $3,341. I told you folks, so many Black Labels this week. Here is a Black Label Japanese Mew VMAX that sold for $3,668. Here we have a PSA 10 Umbreon Prime from Undaunted that sold for $6,001. Here is a Japanese Rayquaza VMAX Black Label that sold for $7,500 this week. Here we have a PSA 8 University Magikarp that sold for $8,198. Here is a CGC10 Tropical Mega Battle Promo Executor card that sold for $13,471. Here we have a CGC10 Japanese Lucky Stadium promo card that sold for $16,666. Which brings me to the auction of the week. We gotta give it to this PSA 10 no rarity symbol Japanese base set Venusaur that sold for a whopping 42,966 big ones. So folks, what do you think of all those black labels? What's going on with the black label market? Why is everybody trying to sell them off? It's weird. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. That's all I got today, and I will catch you in my next one.